The text for the message today comes from the book of John, Gospel of John, chapter 14. I'm going to read verses 1 through 3. This is a text you've possibly heard read before at funerals. It's a beautiful passage of Scripture, reminding us of some very important truths about heaven. John chapter 14. It's really a beautiful chapter. We could read all of it this morning, but for the message, I'm just going to read verses 1 through 3. Now the scene here, Jesus has gathered his disciples together. He's talking to them. His own death is near. The betrayal by Judas, the abandonment by all of the disciples, their doubt and confusion and fear after he is gone. All of these things clearly are on his mind. And he says this to them, beginning in verse 1. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. I love the story of the businessman who sent some flowers, an arrangement of flowers along with a note to a business competitor who had just relocated to a new location, a bigger building. Their business was doing well, expanding, and he sent this flower arrangement with a note. Unfortunately, the florist got the note mixed up with a note that was intended to go to a family for their funeral, someone who had just lost a loved one. And the note that arrived at the new business with a floral arrangement said, "With our deepest sympathy." What was even more embarrassing was the floral arrangement arrived at the funeral with a note that read, "Congratulations on your new location." You and I are going to have a new location one day. As followers of Jesus Christ, that is an assurance that he gives to us. And what I want to tell you this morning from the Scriptures is what Jesus tells us about that new location, what it's going to be like. The first thing is in verse 2, and that is that heaven will be a beautiful place. Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many mansions." Now, one thing that's implied there is that heaven is a place. In other words, we just don't float around in limbo. We don't cease to exist. We're going to a place. D.L. Moody, the famous evangelist, 19th century evangelist, said this: "One day you will read in the papers that D.L. Moody of East Northfield, Massachusetts, is dead. Well, don't believe a word of it. I will have gone up higher, that's all. Out of this old clay tenement into a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And at that moment I will be more alive than I have ever been." Heaven is a place. Jesus says it is a beautiful place. He uses that word mansions to describe where we're going to be living. You know, those of us who live here in Los Angeles, we actually live in a beautiful place. We just don't get to see it because of the smog. I like to go outside at night and look up at the stars. Very interested in the constellations and all of that. The sad fact is that probably only 10 to 15 nights a year you can even see much of what's up there because of the smog. And it's only when we have those torrential rains that come every now and then that clears out the air for a day or so that we're reminded that we're surrounded by beautiful mountains as well. We live in a terribly polluted city. We live in a terribly polluted world. It's a beautiful thing to imagine what a beautiful place heaven will be like. Marco Polo, the 13th century Italian traveler and explorer who traveled around the world, when he went to the Orient, being the first Westerner to go there, he came back and he told marvelous tales of what the Orient was like, and nobody believed him. Because he told of things that were so foreign to their understanding, so marvelous that they thought he was lying, to the point that even on his deathbed, the priests tried to get him to recant these stories, thinking that he would be dying with some kind of sin on his soul, that he had told these lies for so long, and they begged him to admit that he had been lying all of that time. And he said instead, I have not told half of what I saw. When Paul writes about heaven in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, he writes this, eye hath not seen, and ear hath not heard, neither has entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for those who love him. Paul said this after a vision of heaven that the Lord had given him. What heaven is going to be like will be beyond our ability to grasp, but we know it's going to be wonderful. And so heaven will be a beautiful place. Heaven will be a place of rest with no suffering, pain, sorrow, or death. Jesus began his words to the disciples by saying, let not your heart be troubled. I think what he's saying to his disciples and to us is that you may not know everything about what heaven is going to be like. You may not know everything about where you're going, but you can trust in this. You don't have to worry about it. I don't know everything of what heaven is going to be like, but I know there are no stonemasons in heaven building tombstones. I know there are no wreaths on the mansion doors, on the doors of the mansions where we're going to be living. I know there are no cemeteries and no funeral processions. I know that there are no graves on the hillsides of heaven. The Bible tells us that heaven is a place where there will be no more death and sorrow and sickness and pain and tears. In Revelation 21 verse 4, John writes, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are all passed away. John said, and there shall be no more death. Can you imagine a place like that? How many of us here have laid to rest a mother, a father, a husband, a wife, a brother, a sister, a grandparent, a friend? Probably every one of us. As long as we are on this earth, we will experience sorrow and tears. In this world, we're like the children of Israel, wandering through the wilderness. We've been delivered from the promised land, from slavery in Egypt, but we haven't reached the promised land yet. We know we're going there, but we haven't gotten there yet. Delivered from the past bondage, but not yet at the promised land. And this life is filled with sorrow and tears and sickness and death. Even Jesus wept at the grave of his dear friend Lazarus. Paul spoke constantly of his own tears and heartaches. In this life we will always know sorrow. Only in heaven will God wipe away all of those tears. Some of you know my precious little dog, Gus. Sweetest dog that's ever lived. Now, Gus is very, very attached to me. We left him once with our daughter Lisa out in the desert. And Lisa told me that he cried for 3 days. She showed me a picture that she took after we left. He got up in the window near the door where I had walked out. And he sat up in that picture window. There's a ledge there where he could look out. She said he sat there for the longest time just looking out, waiting for me to come back. And cried for days. And that's how he is when I leave. He just mopes. But when I got back, we brought him home. And I sat down that night after everyone had gone to bed. Mary had gone to bed. Jessica had gone to bed. And I sat down in that big easy chair, and Gus jumped up in my lap, and he curled up in my lap, and he looked up at me for the longest time with his eyes wide open like he could hardly believe it. Then eventually he calmed down, and he flipped over on his back, which is how he likes to sleep, and with his little paws up in the air, fell asleep. And you've never seen a creature more at peace and at ease. And I remember having the thought as I watched him there that night, this is what heaven must be like. after all the travail of earth, all the tears, all the sorrow, all the disappointment, all the separation, all the anxiety, to finally just be at peace. Heaven will be a place of perfect rest with no sorrow or tears or pain or suffering or death. And then heaven will be a great reunion. Jesus talked in verse 3 of going to receive the disciples, that they would be there with him. And I'll say something about that in a moment, but also implied is that they would all be there together. There is a life that awaits us beyond the grave, and I find great comfort in that. When I was a little boy and I thought about heaven, I thought of pearly gates, streets of gold, angels floating around on clouds, playing harps. Now, when I was a little boy, I didn't know anybody in heaven. Everybody that I loved was here, right here on earth with me. So my image of heaven was colored by that. Now, as a man, I've laid my dad to rest, my mom, all four of my grandparents, one brother, two of my brother's children who died when they were babies. Heaven is populated now with people I knew and loved. And when I think of heaven now, I think of that. All that, the streets of gold and the pearly gates, I don't think about that. Part of what I think about is that great reunion. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 23, after David's child with Bathsheba had died, David said this, "He will not come to me, but I will go to him." David had confidence that they would be reunited after death. I think of heaven in those terms as well, a place where my dad is, my brother and his two little children, and my mom, my grandparents, aunts and uncles. And not just those people we knew and loved, but others who were followers of Christ. The faithful Christians. Think back, how many faithful Christians have you known over the years who've gone to be with the Lord? What a wonderful reunion it will be with them. It's been my great privilege as a pastor over the years to be with many, many wonderful saints of God as they've come to the end of their lives and to witness their faithful exit from this planet. And I think about some of those Christians that we're going to be reunited with. Christians I knew as a teenage boy who meant so much to me. Christians I've known here at this church who've gone on to be with the Lord. We're going to be reunited with them. And not just with them, with Abraham and Moses and Elijah and Jacob and Paul and John and Luke and all the others. What a great reunion that will be. I love that old hymn, and we sang it this morning. There's a land that is fairer than day. By faith we can see it afar. For the Father waits over the way to prepare us a dwelling place there. In the sweet by and by we shall meet on that beautiful shore. Heaven will be a great reunion. And then finally, heaven will be a place where we will see the Lord face to face. Jesus said to his disciples, "I'm going away, but I'm coming again to receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also." And above all, that's what heaven is going to be. A place where we are with the Lord, without sin, without separation, without illness, without all of the things that affect us in this life. Perfect fellowship with the Lord face to face. When we were about to move to Argentina in 1986 as missionaries, our oldest, one of our children, William, was just a baby. He was months, not even a month old, 30 days old, 1 month old. Jessica was 2, or 2.5. Our oldest child was the only one who had any understanding at all of what was happening. She was 6. And so she had lived in a little town in Mississippi where she had been born for a couple of years, and had lived in a little town in Louisiana for the past 4 years, and she knew those two places, and she knew New Orleans because that's where her grandparents lived. And she didn't know anything about Argentina. I tried to teach her about it and tell her what it was like from what I had read. I'd never been there either. And I remember I asked her one day, trying to gauge how much anxiety, if any, she was having about moving to Argentina. And I asked her, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would you live? And she thought about that for a second, and she pointed her finger at me and she said, with you. Whatever else we say about heaven today, the most important thing is that heaven is going to be a place of perfect fellowship with God. Paul writes about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. He says, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, even as God has known me. That phrase, I know in part, has to do not with knowledge as we think of it, but experience. Paul's saying, when he says, I know in part, he's saying, I can only experience partially what heaven will be like. But he says, one day I will know God as he has known me, which is to say, already fully and completely God has known me, but I will know him one day like that. That word dark, when he says we look through a glass darkly, the Greek word is the word enigma. It's exactly like it is in English. And the meaning is exactly the same. It means something that is confusing or puzzling or incomprehensible. Paul said that's what the afterlife is like. Afterlife is like now. We don't have a clear picture yet. We see only in part. Our understanding is dim and partial, like looking at a blurry image. And he says someday we will see him face to face. And that's what heaven will be, to finally see him face to face in full and complete fellowship and understanding without the barriers of our own sinfulness. And that's what heaven will be, a great reunion, a beautiful place, a place free from suffering and pain and sorrow and death, and a place where we will be with Jesus face to face. And whether it's today or tomorrow or 50 years from now that we go there, we can say with the Apostle Paul, who wrote in Romans chapter 13, the night is far gone, the day is at hand, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. In the year 1666, the city of London was almost totally destroyed by what came to be known as the Great Fire of London. The fire destroyed 13,200 houses, 87 churches, including the great St. Paul's Cathedral, and most of the city's buildings. Of the 80,000 people who lived in the city at that time, 70,000 of them lost their homes. The fire raged for 4 days and 4 nights. One of the men ministering there in the midst of that great suffering was a Baptist preacher by the name of Joseph Stennett. He ministered among those people who lost everything. Their homes, their possessions. People who in an instant went from having a lifetime of possessions to having nothing. And as you can imagine, he was profoundly influenced by that experience. Joseph Stennett had a son, a young boy by the name of Samuel Stennett. Samuel grew up in a home hearing his dad recount the stories of ministering in the midst of people who had staked their lives on the things of this world and who had seen it literally go up in smoke in an instant. And as you can imagine, young Samuel was profoundly influenced by those stories and those experiences. Samuel Stennett also went on to become a Baptist preacher and a hymn writer. He wrote a number of beautiful hymns, but by far the most famous of the hymns that he wrote, and it's in our hymnal, On Jordan's Stormy Banks. Profoundly influenced by the stories his father had told him, he wrote these words, On Jordan's stormy banks I stand, and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land where my possessions lie. And no doubt thinking about those stories of people who had lost everything, he wrote the next words, no chilling winds or poisonous breath can reach that healthful shore. Sickness, sorrow, pain, and death are felt and feared no more. When shall I reach that happy place and be forever blessed? When shall I see my Father's face and in his bosom rest? I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I am bound for the promised land. That's our hope today. In the same passage that we read this morning, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And as we place our faith firmly in Jesus Christ, we can be assured that we are bound for the promised land. This morning we're going to sing our song of invitation. It's hymn number 518, Shall We Gather at the River.